16. On the modification of love. So, the beginning of the Spirit alters the inner structure of love and the form of its manifestation. Usually, or not infrequently, love is but one of its varieties, and the least spiritual. This lower kind of love is composed according to the formula, what is nice is good, and it is reduced to an instinctive pleasure in another's presence. It is exhausted by pity for someone else's bodily and spiritual suffering. In contrast, the spiritual principle, halting the senseless overflow of sensitivity and pointing love towards the true, worthy subject, constantly guides us not to idolize that which we like, what is nice is good, but to enjoy the perfect, I will be good, and then informs us of the internal versatility and variety of external manifestations necessary for spiritual life. For a person who is spiritually undeveloped and helpless, his love begins when he likes something, or where something gives him a pleasant sensation. It flows into the plane in the form of an unspiritual yes and tends to maximum internal and external pleasure. This unspiritual love is most often detached from both the will and the mind, and is directed instead towards imagination and feelings of sensuality. On the contrary, spiritual love has the power to turn away from what is liked and pleasant. It has the power to establish itself at the level of a persistent no. It can take the form of a grave and bleak service. The sole, unchanging function of spiritual love is spiritual benevolence. This means that it always and sincerely wishes everyone not pleasure, not delight, not fortune, not happiness, and not even the absence of suffering, but spiritual perfection, even when it can be acquired only at the cost of suffering and misfortune. The next function of spiritual love is the experienced and intuitive perception of another's identity, which carried out in its entirety to the point of artistic identification is not always realized. At the lower levels of spiritual self-education, it is carried out mainly in relation to ideal, perfect human models, saints and heroes. At the middle level, it can only be in relation to God, in solitude. At the highest levels, only in God and through God, and from people only in relation to those who themselves ask for help, seniority. Spiritual love is always benevolent, but not always identifying, and when identifying, it does not always creatively accept, approve, and sympathize with, and when approving, it is not because I love him, and when sympathizing with, then it is without plunging into a spineless softening, either for myself or the one who suffers. Spiritual love is a love for the perfection of the beloved, or for the beloved in its perfection, and this love for the perfection of the beloved always remains stronger than the fear of his possible suffering. Ordinary love only loves the earthly composition of an individual person and recognizes nothing that could stand in opposition to this as supreme. Hence her sensual and saccharine morality, which places above all else pointless tenderness and unprincipled kindness. In contrast, spiritual love knows what is supreme, and before his face it knows how to control both tenderness and kindness. It knows that between the two basic commandments of Christ concerning the love of God and the love for one's neighbor, visible friction is possible, in which the commission of God's work may require ruthless rigor towards man, and sympathy for a person in such a situation becomes tantamount to a betrayal of God's work. And knowing this, it also knows how to get out of these alleged frictions, because the relationship with God always remains for it the standard, to which relations to people are subordinated. Therefore, for spiritual love, there cannot exist conditions under which it is necessary to betray the work of God out of sympathy for man, but there are always possible situations in which, out of love for God, one can and must hold back their love for man and limit it to the rigor of remedying defects in spiritual well-being, such that the second commandment remains unbroken, for, generally speaking, love is in no way reducible to animal sympathy, which serves to soothe both he who sympathizes and he who is sympathized with. A person who has extinguished the image of God in himself is not in need a weak-willed yes, but instead a sternly condemning no. And this halting and sobering no can and should have its true source in the love for God in heaven and for the divine in the fallen and spiritually extinguished soul. This is how the negative image of love is born and formulated, and it has always led and always will lead to the temptation of short-sighted and sentimental people, judging everything based on appearances and not seeing in the manifestations of such love either a sweet sympathy or a strong sense of pity. They begin to indignantly talk about enmity, hatred, and malice, are appalled, and call for an anti-spiritual and cowardly compassion. And yet, in fact, the spiritual design of love, so necessary to man and so difficult to acquire, gives it a whole series of precious adaptive forms which at the same time do not vaporize and or distort the core nature of love. In the form of a spiritual no, a person loves another real, genuine subject in no less measure than in the form of a spiritual yes, and much more than in the form of an unspiritual yes. Moreover, a love which is capable of adopting a spiritually rejecting image is always more profound, more intense, and more truly faithful than a love which spinelessly turns away from evil in order not to see it, or is willing to compassionately accept it. In order to understand this negative image of love, it is necessary to bear in mind that the spiritually objective and formalized love, while always remaining a blessing, that is, desiring for each person spiritual enlightenment and transformation, at the same time cannot love evil in man. Therefore, wherever it perceives in a person true evil, not weakness, not confusion, not fallen nature, not sinfulness, but self-affirming, anti-spiritual malice, it is forced to modify its individual attitude toward the person in accordance with the evil in his soul, while still always wishing him treatment and purification, and perhaps joyfully aflutter at the thought of the possibility of such a transformation of the evil soul. A spiritually loving person necessarily undergoes a number of modifications in all other functions of his love, in sympathy, approval, support, in creative acceptance, in the desire to put oneself in his position, identify, in the readiness to communicate, and, finally, even in the ability to treat him with basic pity. Each of us must know this from our own experience. There are evil deeds to which we cannot give either sympathy or approval. There are evil purposes that we cannot creatively promote to such an extent that if we can say, I was indirectly useful to them, the soul is overcome by mortal anguish. There are situations in life to enter into which the imagination finds disgusting and the will finds unbearable. There are evil people, a simple conversation with whom leaves the soul groaning like the wounded. There are villains toward whom the last outburst of extinguished pity can only be expressed in the acceleration of their execution. All of these conditions in their basic substance, in their overriding element, remain a modification of spirituality and love, and therefore they do not become evil states of mind and do not lead to evil deeds, and hence only myopia or superficiality can characterize them as manifestations of evil and malice. However, within the constraints of a person's accessible love and possible moral perfection, these conditions are, of course, unfocused and flawed. Absolute wholeness or completion can only be found in love for God, for an absolutely whole and complete perfection. Such an attitude towards a person as such, taken in isolation from God, would always be wrong, based on blindness and idealization. In the love of a man who discovers a true source of evil, the need for narrowing and discernment becomes self-evident. Here there exists a reasonably just measure, a necessary and subjectively immovable distinction. Of course, this measure of love does not lend itself to precise quantitative determination, and the mental dissection of a divided person into beloved virtue and despised depravity remains unachievable. Precisely for this reason, the complexity of an aimlessly beloved subject requires a corresponding complexity in the structure of an aimlessly loving act. It requires of love self-control and adaptability. All these modifications of love, caused by a meeting between true spirituality and true evil, boil down to the fact that a loving yes is poorer in its functions, is reduced in terms of its fullness, and approaches the form of a beneficent no as the object of love deteriorates. Denying love is gradually transformed into negative love and finds its completion in the earthly removal of the denied evildoer. But even during this elimination and after it, spiritual love does not turn into malice and does not become evil. A man is given to pray for both the villain's executioner and for the villain himself, and the Church knows this prayer. In this subjectively induced functional narrowing, and in the gradual strengthening of the element no in the bosom of yes, spiritual love passes through a whole series of classical states which are spiritually necessary, meaningfully justified, and religiously faithful. These states express the gradual detachment and separation between one who loves and one who loses the right to the fullness of love. They begin with the possible total love of man and end with a prayer for the executed villain. Such is the gradually mounting sequence. Disapproval, lack of sympathy, chagrin, reprimand, condemnation, refusal to facilitate, protest, accusation, demand, insistence, mental compulsion, the infliction of psychological suffering, austerity, severity, indignation, anger, break from communication, boycott, physical compulsion, disgust, contempt, the impossibility of putting oneself in the other's situation, suppression, ruthlessness, execution. And each of these states, in the presence of a real evil and with true sight, can be a spiritually healthy and vitally advantageous reaction to villainous manifestations and deeds. And thus the task of a person striving for a spiritually faithful life will not consist in unconditionally avoiding these states, but in not allowing them to arise without sufficient grounds, in order to prevent them from eclipsing the clarity of the spiritual eye, and in order to always keep them in the ancestral bosom of native goodwill, where always is retained the ability to restore loving totality. The highest and purest dispassion is freedom from evil and personal passions, from the passions of a spiritually undefined, ungodly self, but it is not to be found in indifference, nor statuesque inability to change, nor lack of will, nor inaction. The highest and purest dispassion knows its ascents and tensions, its storms, thunders, and eruptions, but we must recognize that their source is not the animal in man, and certainly not the instinctual desires of the animal, but the spirit, its vision, and its fire. These tempests and thunderstorms then show not evil, nor malice, nor the weakness of a man, but his strength in good. And not having these to hand harms the nature of the spirit, their absence being spiritually unnatural. And if the Christian ever doubted this, he would have to remember the thunder that divinely rattled the Pharisees and scribes, the merchants in the temple, that which raged over Jerusalem which assaulted his prophets, and those who seduced minors. It is enough to perceive just once in these thunders the very power of that love which teaches us to be charitable to our enemies, to forgive offenses, and to joyfully share our fortune, for the idealization of a sentimental lack of will to begin to fade away. In one great and terrible historical moment, the act of divine love, in the guise of wrath and scourge, drove out a sacrilegious crowd from the temple. This act was and will always be the greatest prototype and justification for all spiritually and meaningfully justified manifestations of negative love. Having before the mind's eye all the prophets, princes, judges, educators, and warriors, one could calmly refer them to a possible court which would approach them from a weak-willed sentimentality, and which would potentially convict them as haters rejected by God. Their business is to assert themselves in the power of spiritual goodwill and in the clarity of spiritual sight, and further, to remember the bleak difficulty of the driven struggle. For the denying love is joyless and painful for man. It demands from him a feat, and moreover a harsh feat. Here you will need strength, endurance, and stamina. In this, great stress upon the will, fidelity to the burdensome duties one takes on, selflessness and constant spiritual activity in the form of self-purification are all needed. And since the denying love rests not on personal calculations and passions, but on a genuine trial of evil and on the spiritual necessity of answering it, it cannot be arbitrarily dampened or converted into a positive love, no matter how a perhaps fatigued or languishing soul prays this to be so. The risk of misunderstanding this struggle and its burden, as well as morally crooked judgment coming from spectators who are lazy, timid, sensitive, and hypocritical, completes the harsh nature of this feat, under the burden of which noble and refined souls have always taken courage, and being courageous, never doubted the justice of their work. Thus, the source of the Spirit alters the likeness of love and the form of its manifestations. It is thanks to this influence of the Spirit on the primitive, naive, direct, and blind power of love that it acquires higher capabilities and higher callings, and as a result, its entire relationship to evil is affirmed on the following grounds. In order for love to effectively resist evil, it must be spiritually understood, limited, and modified. But, once comprehended and modified, it is the original and supreme foundation of man's entire struggle waged against evil. The whole problem of resistance to evil is resolved by this basic principle. The struggle is fought with love, but with spiritualized love. This means that the rule, resistance to evil comes not from love, if someone wishes to establish such a rule, is fundamentally rejected in all its possible interpretations and implementations. Every act which emerges from some other source in fact does not fight evil, but multiplies it, or fights not with evil, but only with its separate, superficial symptoms. Therefore, we must condemn the unloving non-resistance. When someone tries to sober villains with generosity and compliance, driven not by love, but, for example, by rational calculation or a cowardly lack of will, however, we must also condemn cases of unloving compulsion. That is, if somebody is fighting villains out of feelings of spite, revenge, hunger, greed, or lust for power. Both can be psychologically understood. Both can be both relatively harmful and relatively useful in the overall economy of forces. But the genuine resistance to evil cannot be found in any such cases. Therefore, there remains one single, universal rule, to resist evil from love, out of love giving all of one's own where this is needed, out of love compelling and suppressing where necessary, out of love persuading and out of love executing, out of love not giving anything of one's own if what is yours is more than yours, if it is at the same time God's. A shrine, a church, a homeland, or their material embodiment. And in all these manifestations, in giving, in not giving, in imploring, in executing, this love will not be either indifference, self-sufficient sensitivity, timid assumption, weak-willed pity, or complicity. Resistance to evil is generated by love, but it is not directed towards a man's animal nature nor his Philistine soulfulness, but to his spirit and spirituality. A love that knows how to love both the soul of man and all of his earthly nature only in the measure of their spiritual illumination and infusion, for it consciously and unconsciously perceives a person and measures him by the innermost standards of conscience, dignity, honor, sincerity, patriotism, and righteousness in the face of God, therefore invariably turning its negative face to all that is unscrupulous, humiliating, dishonest, false, treacherous, and sacrilegious. In the struggle against evil, such love has affection for the sighted spirit and the world-embracing will, and therefore it sees the work of God in the universe and on earth, and actively, creatively forwards it by its own power. Because what it loves, its object, is, first of all, an individual work of God on earth. In relation to it, love is whole. Further, its object is the divine embodiment in an earthly temple, and in relation to it, love acquires the face of defensive reverence. Further, this is the divine spiritual principle found in the oppressed neighbor, and in relation to him, love acquires the face of a benevolent compassion. And finally, this is the spiritual principle which is found perishing in the villain, and in relation to him, love is the face of a pure and severe pursuit of good. This is why the whole doctrine which teaches that the active resistance against a villain's evil is contrary to love falls like a harmful moral prejudice. Like every other true form of resistance to evil, compulsion and suppression are works of love, and love itself, if it is rejected, there follows not compulsion as such, nor bodily compulsion and suppression specifically, but malevolence in the fight against evil, that is, malicious compulsion and malicious suppression. But the active resistance against the villain's evil designs on others, and against the villain himself is not evil, but good, and therefore it can and must be the work of a pious love.